Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. In the past, if you were an ambitious member of the European middle class and not part of the aristocracy, you were confronted with a closed economy and an overpopulated country. So you might go to India or some other colony to make your fortune and return home to find a wife like a character out of a Jane Austen novel. But in the 20th century, you could practice a lazier form of colonialism. Why risk death and disease to become the master of people in the third world when you could bring the colonized to you, whether in Europe or the US? And within a smaller European context, a once mighty Germany could no longer rule Europe by force, because that didn't work out very well for Germany or for Europe. Instead, a mini empire was created, the European Union, allowing Germany, with a fig leaf of a France in decline, to exploit Europe economically. The European Union sounds like something the left should maybe admire. Multiculturalism, free movement, and the right hates it, so we're supposed to love it. But it's been fraying in recent years, first with the collapse of the Greek economy, then Brexit, then the rise of neo-fascists in Hungary and Poland, and now with the EU becoming indistinguishable with NATO and hence America. To understand why the EU exists and how it's changing due to the financial crisis and the war in Ukraine, I'm joined by Costas Lapavitsas, a professor of economics at SOAS, author of The Left Case Against the EU, and a former Syriza MP. Costas, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I should also add that you have a forthcoming book called The State of Capitalism, published by Verso, and that will be out next year. So everybody keep their eyes out for that. And I guess now to all the topics at hand, there's so much I want to talk to you about. And a good place to start is perhaps with some of the latest news we've been hearing around the EU. We know that the EU announced they would give Ukraine candidate status. And I think to really understand the significance of what that would mean if it actually does happen, if Ukraine does join the EU, and to understand the EU's role, we have to maybe start with, why does the EU even exist in the first place, and what is its role today?
That's a very big question, and we can be here for a very long time, but I will try and summarize it for you. I mean, the EU has been around for several decades now. What it does now is very different to what it was doing in the 60s and so on. It began, you see, sometime in the 50s. Mm-hmm. It was a very different configuration of world power. The United States was the dominant power even then, and that's very important, which I will mention again in a minute. But more significant than that is that economic policy and the understanding of how capitalism works was based on Keynesianism. The idea that the state can intervene, the state should intervene, that there should be full employment, that policies can be mobilized for full employment, there should be growth, and so on. Much of it was ideology, but it was very different from today. That's when the EU was started. It was started in a very different way, as a coalition of major capitalist powers in Europe on a Keynesian, roughly, basis, interventionist basis. And the idea was to create free trading within those countries, give more scope for state intervention, and proceed along those lines. Today, it's very different because, of course, since the 1980s, we've had the neoliberal transformation of the world. The US remains the superpower, obviously, nothing like what it was in the 50s, but it remains the superpower today. But economic policy is very different. And the practice of capital is very different. The EU, during this period, the last 4 decades, has become a neoliberal citadel. There is no Keynesianism. There is no alliance of main capitalist powers in Europe to use state intervention and to coordinate economies and to protect from the outside and so on. This is now a neoliberal outfit, thoroughly so, and we can discuss it if you like as we proceed. Neoliberalism is embedded in its very bones. I mean, it's really, truly neoliberal. It's been transformed, and it acts in that way. So basically, the EU now is an economic alliance, state-based alliance, which has become a lot bigger than it used to be, of course. It is permeated by neoliberalism, and it promotes it. it promotes neoliberalism. It has practically no connection with the ideas it started with. It is very, very different. So that's where we are. In all this, the role of the United States has always been very critical. When it was started in the 50s, within a Keynesian framework, it was started at the behest of the US as well. It wasn't only a European initiative. It was always under the aegis of the United States as the leading power. And the aim was, of course, to oppose the Soviet Union at that time. There was a profound anti-communism built into the EU from the very beginning. The US remains the overlord even today, as we have seen in the case of Ukraine. So the EU is very much a project started in Europe, but under the thumb of the United States. It remains, and it will be in the years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, I think, an important dimension of it. But of course, you mentioned the Keynesianism that, defined the EU, when that also defined the US, even more so in the EU back in the 50s, and how much it's evolved. And I do want to talk a bit about that evolution. But first, because you mentioned how the EU is basically like a neoliberal arrangement, what would the impact be if Ukraine actually does join the EU? Because it still stands to be seen if that would in fact happen. But if it did, what would the impact be on the EU? And then, of course, I think more importantly in this case, what would the impact be on Ukraine if it were to actually become a member?
I think that the chances of Ukraine joining the EU, actually properly joining the EU, are pretty close to zero, non-existent.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen. To be honest, and that's again something we can discuss, I don't know what the Ukraine will mean, the way things are going. What kind of country will emerge after this terrible war that's taking place at the moment? So this is basically an exercise in what might happen if this and this were to happen, which it isn't. But the reason why the EU extended candidate membership status to Ukraine is because it's obviously political. It's obviously political. And that remains the main strength of the EU in Europe and elsewhere. It acts as a kind of signal to various countries that they belong to the neoliberal club. They assert their membership of the neoliberal club. It also creates a kind of political security insurance for the elites of these countries, because of course the EU is under the thumb of the Americans, and when you are a member or a candidate member, that means that the Americans might protect you, ally themselves with you, and so on. So that's basically what's happening. It's a political move. Economically and socially, I mean, the Ukraine currently, the way it works, is basically a dictatorship. There is nothing. I mean, they present it as
Are you suggesting that this isn't a war for democracy? How could you? Yeah.
No, the Ukraine currently, the way the regime works, is basically a dictatorship. Now, you might argue it's because of war, but the dictatorial tendencies were present before the war broke out. Okay, the regime is clearly dictatorial. It's run. The country is run by an alliance of security forces and the army. So basic elements of democracy, which presumably the EU requires of its members, don't exist. They just don't exist. I mean, parties are illegal. The leader of the opposition is in prison. I mean, what democracy?
Right.
So that's the first thing that has to be said. As for the economy, the Ukraine is destroyed. The war has basically destroyed it, and the way things are panning out, the Ukraine will be left without control over its industrial heartland. It will basically be a small, ruined agrarian economy if it survives. How would it integrate into the capitalist club that is the EU? It just doesn't make any sense. Even if it did, through some miracle, the prospects for growth of what would remain of the Ukraine within the EU club, basically non-existent. I mean, the EU is not, as a neoliberal club, is not constructed to support countries that have the characteristics of Ukraine at the moment, it will be lodged into no growth, permanent state of a marginal country dominated by the Western European capital, if it came to that. Maybe that's what the Ukrainian elite wants, insofar as you can talk about an elite there.
Well, going back to the issue of the EU, and we talked a little bit about, you described how it was at first and how it is now. I mean, this EU as an ideal, like it's emerged as what you've called this kind of European promised land that even many on the left believe in now. But the left used to be quite critical. And of course, here I'm talking about the European left, perhaps the American left, I don't know if that applies to the American left. But that said, the left in Europe used to be critical of the EU. So what explains that transformation? And I think here, maybe this is a good time to maybe walk us through the history throughout the 1980s and how that impacted the left across Europe.
That's a long and painful story. It's not good. Let me first of all say that the idea of federal Europe is not new, right? It goes back a long time. And in the interwar years, for example, in the 20s and the 30s especially, there was a very lively discussion among European intellectuals, economists and others, about what an economic federation and a general federation of European countries would look like. The aim there was, of course, to oppose the Soviet Union at the time, which had emerged as a significant power in the East. So the debate of a federal Europe goes back a long time, and leading economists and others on the right and conservatives have taken part in this. So it's not new. Then came the war. The war put the situation in an entirely different footing in Europe. What emerged was a destroyed continent as capitalist powers fought it out, Nazis and so on, and as the Soviet Union emerged as a major power, dominant power in the East with the different social and political organization. The question of a united Europe then, or a federal Europe, posed itself in a very different way. For the left, for some of the left, especially the social democratic left, in Western European countries, Italy, France, and so on, the idea of a federation began to look appealing. And that's when the first sustained efforts were made to present the EU as potentially a left-wing project. It didn't come from a bad place, I've got to say, right? Socialists and socialist parties and so on understand that nation states are problematic, understand that divisions are artificial, we are internationalists. The European left has always been in favor of alliances and the commonality of purpose of European working class and different components of European working class and so on. That's always been there. So it didn't come from a bad place, this idea of federation, but it became tangled up with the Keynesianism and the American power and so on that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So it started acting as a left cover for a union that emerged in the 50s, which was Keynesian, which suited a lot of these people, the social democrats on the left, which seemed that they were they were on the right path. And it seemed that the EU, as it then existed back in the 60s and 70s, could become a left-wing project on Keynesian grounds and operate in this way and help working class people and promote union and control capital. It didn't cut much ice with a lot of people within the movement. It never penetrated down to the grassroots, and especially among the trade unions, but it was always there among the intellectuals. What happened in the 80s? And precisely as the EU shifted from being a Keynesian outfit into a neoliberal outfit, right, thoroughly so, is that, of course, the workers' movement was defeated in Europe. Trade unions were defeated in several countries in Europe. And the most interesting case in this respect is Britain, and we can come back to it. And obviously, in the late 80s, the Soviet Union collapsed. That was a deadly combination for much of the social democratic left, because it looked as if there was no prospect of any kind of independent socialist activity. And it made the idea of the EU as a socialist, or at least socially minded bastion, seem more appealing. Precisely at the time when the EU was becoming more neoliberal. That's the paradox. Precisely at that time.
No.
So basically, trade unions, left-wing parties, even communist parties began to be influenced by this idea that the way forward would be through the European Union. We can't deliver it locally in our own countries because we'll be defeated, because we're weak. But we will do it if we move, as it were, up, right? If we shift up a few levels, we will do it internationally. And it ticked a lot of boxes. It seemed internationalist. It seemed optimistic. It seemed that there was this power out there which could overcome the nation states and deliver things for workers. All that, I repeat, while the EU was becoming thoroughly neoliberal. And but a lot of people on the left kept saying, yes, it is, but it can become socialist. Its core is socialist because I say so. And then we will intervene and collectively force a change from the top. And that's been a very, very persistent thing among a lot of parties on the left. It's the outcome of defeats for the left. In a sense, the shift in the outlook of the left relative to the EU happened in the 1980s, began to happen in a big way in the 1980s, and that was the result of sustained defeats by the labor movement and by the political parties of the left that we observed back then in the 80s. The transformation, the shift away from the shift in the balance of power away from labor and towards capital, the sense of impotence that is easy to see in France, in Britain, and elsewhere when it comes to the labor movement. The sense of impotence that they can't really take on capital aggressively, changing things in a neoliberal direction, made trade unions and organizations of the left, political parties of the left in Europe, to think that the answer is the European Union. The answer is this body that is transnational, beyond the nation state, potentially socialist or potentially anti-capitalist for the reasons that I explained just before. And therefore, all our attention should go there. That's where the fight will be. We can change Europe by intervening from above, as it were, or from outside our borders. In other words, what I can't do within my own country because I feel weak, I will do it by moving to Brussels, which, if you think about it for a minute, you realize it's absurd. And I can tell you how it's absurd by this when we discuss the actual workings of the institutions of the European Union. But even without discussing those institutions, as a policy for the left, it's immediately nonsensical. If you can change the world, you start where you are. You don't rely on Brussels to do it. And you don't rely on these institutions across borders to do it. All this unfortunate acceptance of the putative, progressive role of the EU happened, I repeat, precisely as the EU was shifting in a neoliberal, opening neoliberal direction. It was becoming more and more neoliberal institutionally, in terms of its outlook, in terms of its ideology, and so on. It's a complete paradox. It's a complete paradox, and it is taking a long time to shift.
And so, speaking about those institutions, I mean, one of the things that I think is a really good framing for this is that you actually framed the EU as this incredibly anti-democratic arrangement. And I think that speaks to the institutions that are at the heart of it. So can you elaborate on that?
It's profoundly anti-democratic. It isn't just undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. The EU is something that was created from the beginning, from the top. It's a top-down institution. It was created by nation states, leading personalities and mechanisms of the chief capitalist states of Europe at the behest of the Americans, the American superpower. So from the beginning, it was a top-down thing. Now, suffice it to mention two institutions of the European Union to show you how undemocratic it is. The list is long, can be very long, but I'll mention just two. The EU works on the basis of a legal framework. It's a transnational institution, an alliance of nation states on the basis of treaty, formally, and needs a legal framework. He has created this legal framework. I want to stress how strange this is so that you so that our readers appreciate it. Bourgeois democracy, as we've known it since the days of John Locke and all the others back in the 16th and 17th centuries, bourgeois democracy is obviously about the independence of the legislature, the judiciary, and so on. But that must be accountable to the popular will, right? Going back to Rousseau and so on. That's basically bourgeois democracy. That whatever you do with the courts must be, in a sense, consistent with, and they must serve the popular will. Therefore, there are mechanisms in advanced capitalist countries that presumably ensure this. And in the United States, of course, we know this can reach ridiculous situations, but that's a different issue. But that's how bourgeois democracy is supposed to work. And there would be elections, and the powers would be accountable, and so on. Okay. How does the European legal system work? Because the EU needs law, right? So there is law in Europe, which is enormous. I'm going to stress, first of all, that the volume of law in Europe is enormous. Thousands of decisions, articles, and so on. It's a vast body of law. This law is created by the European Parliament, which is not a real parliament. It's not elected in any kind of direct way by people on an equitable basis. It's basically a horse trading arrangement, the European Parliament between political organizations across borders. More than that, European law is created and implemented by the European Court of Justice. Every country, bourgeois country, needs a highest court, right? And it has it, which acts as the final word for the judiciary. This is supposed to be accountable to somebody, still, to the political leadership. Well, the European Court of Justice is accountable to no one. It's a court that exists suspended by its own bootstraps. It's this thing created outside nation states. No one exercises any control over it. It's not accountable to anybody. It has enormous power, and it is the main lever of neoliberalism in Europe. It interprets cases from a consistent neoliberal perspective. It makes its decisions law, and that has acted as one of the key mechanisms for transforming the EU in a neoliberal direction, for promoting capital over labor, for allowing freedom of movement, for allowing all these things that capital wants. No one controls this court. No one has power over it. And the legislation that it implements and the decisions that it makes, which become part of European law, have got constitutional status. They're actually superior to national law. So if national law contradicts European law has precedence. So I mean, that by itself, it tells you immediately this is a very strange arrangement, which is profoundly anti-democratic. And it's obvious why it's anti-democratic. Suppose you get a left-wing government, or indeed doesn't have to be left-wing, a government that doesn't agree with the current policies of the EU. It could be right-wing, incidentally. And it decides to follow different policies, economic policies. European law, which has a constitutional status and which is actually enforced by the European Court of Justice, will make that an impossibility because there will be penalties imposed. It acts as a trap, in other words, a complete trap. And that is evidence, as I said, of how anti-democratic Europe is. It stops any kind of alternative economic policies. I can give another example, if you want, of how anti-democratic it is. Countries, advanced capitalist countries, have a central bank. You look around, they all have it. Federal Reserve in the United States, Bank of England, and so on. Now, the central bank is a very peculiar institution, and again, we can discuss it. It's a bank, but it's also an arm of the state. It creates money. Therefore, it is the pivotal monetary institution in contemporary capitalism, and one of the most important institutions of modern capitalism altogether. Easily the most important economic institution. That tells you something about contemporary capitalism as well. But leave that aside. That's the fact. That's a fact. That's how it is. Okay. The central bank in most countries is actually accountable to political forces, to the government. Formally, it is supposed to be independent, but it isn't. That's just the word. It's independent of the electorate. It's actually an arm of the state. Therefore, there is give and take with the local domestic political powers. And you've seen it in the United States, right? How the Federal Reserve works with the government and makes policy and so on. The European Central Bank is accountable to no one. It creates policies. It implements policies. It runs policies. It sits like a vastly powerful institution over the economies of Europe. It makes decisions as it sees fit. It attracts all the central banks of the member states within it. Okay, that's how it works. It's a jerry-built thing, but very, very powerful. And it does whatever it likes. And its decisions have got the status of law. If it issues a directive, it becomes law. Who controls the ECB? Who is it accountable to?
European capitalists.
Yeah,
I assume. Yeah.
So it's inherently anti-democratic, and we know that because the ECB, whenever need arises, whenever any challenge to the neoliberal arrangements of Europe emerges, the ECB comes down like a ton of bricks and stops it. That's how the EU works. Deep at its heart, and I can give you many other examples, but I don't want to
Well, I think you have some personal experience with that, and I think it's a good segue to ask, how has this EU structure that you just described created a kind of periphery and core in Europe itself with different roles for different countries? What has this meant for Germany, for example, which seems to sit at the top of the EU, and then a country like Greece, which you've had experience in?
That is a very important question, I would say, and also a question that can allow us to talk about how the EU has changed, because it keeps changing. Nothing stays the same in capitalism anyway. I'll tell you at the beginning what's very, very interesting here. As I said, the EU is basically an alliance of nation states on the basis of a treaty. It's a treaty-based alliance. They're all member states. They're all supposed to be formally equal. When the EU was established and as it transformed itself, the ideology was always the same. We will create convergence. By joining this club, we will create convergence. We will become similar. We will homogenize this outfit. And that, incidentally, is a very appealing thing for people who wish to join now. The myth still exists that if you join it, you'll become well off and that you will get out of poverty and so on, which is we discussed previously in the case of Ukraine. That was the myth. And that was the official ideology. What we've seen in the last 2 to 3 decades is that the opposite has happened. As you join the European Union and adopt the neoliberal strategies that the Union supports and implements, divergence takes place, the opposite of convergence, and actually the creation of a core and periphery on a new basis. See, core and periphery is a very old thing in capitalism. We know that capitalism does it. It's in its DNA. Right? As capital spreads across the world market, it automatically creates situations of subordination, and core countries dominate peripheral countries. In the past, this would take the form of imperialism, colonies, and so on, but can take other forms too. We've known that for a long time. Well, the European Union has shown us that through the mechanisms of the Union, we've got new forms of core and periphery. New forms have emerged. And the mechanisms of the European Union have been instrumental to this. It's the opposite of what the Union set out to do economically. Not only there is no convergence, there's actually growing divergence, and there's a growing division between core and periphery across Europe. There are many peripheries, incidentally. There's a periphery in the south with certain characteristics. Spain, Portugal, Greece, obviously, parts of Italy. Italy cannot, it's an in-between country. There's a periphery in Eastern Europe, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia. These are different different characteristics, different kind of periphery. There's a periphery in the Baltics, which again, partly different features in terms of how it works, all revolving around the core. And the core is basically Germany, France, which is not in the same league as Germany economically, and a number of other countries around these two, right? This axis of these two countries. Within the core, hegemonic role is played by Germany. Germany is the hegemon, but it's a very peculiar hegemon, as we can discuss. It's not. It's hegemonic in Europe, but that's about it. Now, this division and this outlook of capitalism in Europe is integrally related to the EU. The EU has done that, and in particular, the monetary union. The monetary union, because, as you know, roughly 30 years ago, Europe created a common currency. The common currency was a fundamental step in the neoliberal shift of the EU that I mentioned to you before. It was the single most important lever in effecting the economic transformation of the EU. The common currency worked as a mechanism to impose neoliberal mechanisms and principles across the Union, and the power that's behind it is the European Central Bank. So the European Central Bank, which is thoroughly undemocratic, is the foundation of the common currency and a mechanism for encouraging the neoliberal shift of the EU, and in an unexpected way, the creation of core and periphery. That's what they didn't expect. See, capitalism is like that. You set out to achieve certain things. You've got excellent plans. What turns out is not what you expected. I say this because a lot of people on the left think that the capitalist class plans everything.
Yeah.
It doesn't. The capitalist class plans, for sure, but the world doesn't turn out the way it planned it. That's not what happens. And here, what we get is this division between core and periphery in Europe, which is very, very pronounced. I've had experience of what this means in the case of Greece, which is a certain kind of periphery, subservient to the core, and its domination is ensured by the monetary union, as I said. For countries like Greece and like Spain and like Portugal and so on, being peripheral here means having an economy that depends on services, with weak manufacturing, high debt, dominated by financial mechanisms from the core, and having very weak growth prospects. It's an economy that, these are economies generally that don't have much capacity to compete in the manufacturing field, and they are trapped in that kind of financialized existence along the southern periphery of Europe that is dominated by the ECB and the monetary union.
And, and obviously, like, to speak to what you were saying, you actually were part of an emergence to challenge that paradigm, and it was crushed, as the EU is able to crush with its anti-democratic institutions. But I'm curious, how did Germany end up at the top of this system, becoming this kind of European ideal? Because, Germany was destroyed during World War II. So after that destruction, how does it then end up on top again?
There are different periods and different mechanisms at play. Germany, by about the 1970s, was certainly the most dynamic industrial capitalism in Europe. Its industrial sector was the most dynamic, productive, and competitive in Europe, even from the 1970s. It has remained so. The real power of German capital today is its industrial base. It is the true industrial base of Europe. Doesn't mean that it can compete with China across the board or with the United States across the board, but it can compete in certain things today. It can compete on automobiles, for instance. It can compete on machine tools. It can compete on chemicals, heavy manufacturing. It cannot compete when it comes to advanced electronics, IT, and so on. I stress this because people often misunderstand. And that's a weakness of European capitalism altogether. But Germany remains the heart of the productive sector of European capitalism in that way. The only other country in Western Europe, actually across Europe, that has an industrial base similar or at least comparable to that of Germany is Italy in the north. And that's it. For industrial capability in Europe, that's it. Other countries have got capacity. I don't want to downplay it, in Britain and so on, but it doesn't compare with that. Germany then is the dominant industrial center of Europe. That's the characteristic outlook of German capitalism right now. And from that follow a number of other things. It is still financialized, but it's not financialized the same way as Britain or France, which has shrunk its industrial base and financialized avidly. France is financializing like there's no tomorrow the last few years. Germany remains that's German capitalism at its foundations. The monetary...
Yeah, go on. No, go ahead. Finish your thought, sorry.
The monetary union was built at a time when German industrial predominance was well established. The European Union was moving in a neoliberal direction. Other countries could not compete with Germany industrially. France could not compete with Germany industrially. And what this meant was that periodically in Europe, because of the power of German industry and its ability to export, you would get balance of payments crisis within Europe. German capital, exporting capital and industrial capital had such strength in the domestic market of Europe that periodically France and Italy and other smaller countries would find it difficult to compete in the markets for manufacturing and other goods, and there would be a balance of payments crisis, and there would be a forcible readjustment of exchange rates. It happens in the world market, right? That was very painful for France and Italy when they had to do it, because that has costs for the working class and for capital domestically. It was also not easy for Germany to go through that, because of course Germany was always keen to keep the exchange rate low to protect its competitiveness. So that was the reality of Europe as Germany emerged as the leading industrial power. The European Monetary Union was created against this narrow economic background. And it was a French idea. It wasn't really a German idea. I say this because you asked me about how Germany emerged in the position in which it is. The French wanted it. The French wanted it in order to deal with this economic disturbance mechanism, in order to get out of this problem periodically devaluing the franc. Okay. The other thing that the French also wanted, the French ruling class wanted at the time, was of course to devise an economic mechanism that would act as a controlling device of reunified Germany, because that happened, the monetary union happened as Germany was about to reunify, to absorb the East. And obviously, with the experience of the Second World War and so on, the French, the English, capitalists and so on, were very scared what this might mean.
Yeah.
So the understanding was, and the aim was of the French elite, that we create a monetary union, we bring Germany into it, there'll be mechanisms through which monetary policy can be controlled jointly, and that will act as a controlling device over Germany altogether. It wasn't a German idea. It was a French idea.
Ah, okay.
Originally.
I see. Speaking to the issue of Germany's on the top of this game, this is something that you and I had kind of talked about before we were recording, but how is German hegemony different from American hegemony? Because you specifically call it conditional. So what does that mean?
Let me spell it out to you then. That's the right time to do it. Now, Germany finds itself in this arrangement of the monetary union, and as the EU shifts in a neoliberal direction, which we've discussed. Right? For the German ruling class, which already possesses a strong industrial base, as I mentioned, the problem is serious. What do? How do you absorb the East? And how do you deal with this new arrangement that's emerged of monetary union and the transformation, the single market, and so on, this neoliberal shift? How do you deal with that? The rise of German industrial capitalism in the 50s and 60s after the war was based on a very particular type of domestic arrangement among between capital and labor, or among capital, labor, and the state. A very peculiar kind of social democracy of the 50s and the 60s, which basically meant a triangular balance of power and negotiation taking place annually in Germany between unions, employers, and the state on a Keynesian social democratic basis, right, as I indicated. That's how German capitalism established its industrial strength back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That arrangement basically meant that negotiations were engaged in every year, and wage levels were agreed, which basically split the gains in productivity between capital and labor. And as is well known, until the 70s, well into the 70s, real wages actually grew. That's the characteristic of the long boom. And that was the mechanism through which this happened in Germany. And that sustained German industrial preeminence and power. When the German elite was faced with the new conditions of the monetary union, absorbing the East and dealing with the neoliberal shift of the EU in the early 90s, that kind of triangular arrangement went out of the window. The real answer that they gave was domestic. Basically, and unfortunately, the trade unions accepted what was essentially a Faustian pact. They accepted a deal whereby all the gains in productivity will go to capital as long as there would be jobs, as long as there would not be unemployment. And that basically meant freezing wages for nearly 2 decades, from about the late 80s to well into the after the crisis, basically 15 to 20 years, there was a complete wage freeze in Germany. In other words, the balance of power between capital and labor was shifted in favor of capital. All the gains in productivity ended up in the pockets of capitalists, and wages remain frozen. Well, if that's the case, then what you're going to get is a boost to competitiveness. German capitalists found themselves, because this is cumulative, you see, year in, year out, it becomes stronger and stronger. German capitalists found themselves incredibly powerful. They were powerful already, and through this mechanism, they dominated markets, and they transformed the internal market with the EU into their own market. Basically, they came to dominate it, and then on the basis of that, they could move to global, to the world market for exports and so on. Germany emerged as proportionately the biggest exporter in the world. And that was an outcome of the monetary union. In other words, the economic arrangement that German capital imposed on Germany was freeze wages, suppress domestic demand, impose austerity permanently in the domestic economy, and export on the basis of rising competitiveness. And they came to dominate. They became dominant. That is the foundation of German hegemony. It actually driven by domestic conditions and implemented through the monetary union. Why? Well, think about it. If there was no monetary union and Germany attempted to do the same thing, it wouldn't succeed. There would be an adjustment. There would be exchange rate crisis. There would be a realignment of prices globally, and they wouldn't be able to do it longer term. The euro allows them to do it. The euro is fundamental to German hegemony. Germany can be hegemonic only through the euro and everything that this means, only through the EU. That's not the case for the United States.
No.
That's not.
And to bring it to the United States, to broaden out a little bit, I think it's at the end of the day, like you had also mentioned to me, the euro could never challenge the dollar. So it seems to me like when you really think about the EU, in many ways, on a broader scale, it's actually the US that's in charge. Because when I look at the decisions that the Europeans make, like they make these disastrous decisions that actually hurt them. Like why else would the EU, for example, go along with certain foreign policies that benefit US elites, US interests, while actually destabilizing the EU? And what I mean by this is the sort of self-destructive policies. Ukraine is the biggest example at the moment. The way that Europe is going about dealing with the Ukraine issue, it's basically just letting the US take the lead, even though it's actually harming Europe as we speak. Whether we're talking about inflation or a rising energy crisis. You also have past policies that weren't so long ago with the US policy on Libya, on Syria, which were completely disastrous, but actually blew back on Europe far more than on the US, whether we're talking about security problems with like ISIS attacks across European capitals, or the refugee crisis that literally changed European politics and fed the far right. But all of that's to say, all of these American-led policies are so destructive for Europe. Is the EU actually sovereign? Like what explains the fact that they go along with these crazy policies that are just shooting themselves in the feet?
I mean, it's a very difficult question, right? But you put your finger on probably, I mean, one of the major issues of world politics today. What explains this incredible weakness of European capitalism? What explains it? Now, I think you've got to start with Germany and France, obviously, which cannot compete economically with Germany, but has an important political role in Europe. And the point here is, which we already mentioned before, German hegemony, which is real in Europe. If the German elite doesn't want to do something or doesn't want something done, it doesn't happen in Europe by and large, okay? Through the mechanisms of the EU, right? So its hegemony in Europe is real, but its hegemony is conditional on the mechanisms of the EU. It doesn't make the mechanism, doesn't create the mechanisms. Other people create them, or the mechanisms are created jointly, and then Germany dominates through them. That is a very peculiar localized hegemony. Germany is a local hegemon. It dominates Europe, and that's about it. For a time, it was thought that on the basis of European hegemony, it could actually challenge the United States, or the EU as a whole could challenge the United States. There is no prospect of that at all. And the political dimensions of German hegemony remain very weak, very weak. It has emerged as an economic hegemon. It has considerable political power within Europe. Still, it can actually impose its will politically within Europe. It can never challenge the United States. It doesn't have the wherewithal economically. The economy is not big enough, and it doesn't dominate Europe well enough for that. And obviously, politically, it suffers from lack of ideology that would allow it to do it, lack of political mechanisms that will allow it to do it. Germany remains, as we've seen, subservient to the United States, and that is a very interesting aspect of US hegemony, because other ruling elites are the same. Japan is subservient to the United States. It isn't just Europe. You have another center of capitalist power in the East, which was a very big economy, but politically, it is entirely subservient to the United States. That is characteristic of US imperialism. It isn't just Europe. But in the case of Europe, which concerns us here, Germany is perhaps the most extreme paradox of this. It dominates Europe, as I said, in a certain way, right? Conditional way. It is subservient to the Americans. The outcome is disastrous because globally, when it comes to global affairs, the Germans seem incapable of imposing their will and projecting their own power interests onto the world stage. They seem completely incapable of doing it. And there's case after case through which we've seen it. And of course, the French seem to be a bit more aggressive and more active in this, but they haven't got the wherewithal. So it's basically posturing more than reality when it comes to imperial presence globally. The real player here is Germany, and Ukraine is the test. The US has dictated a certain line of approach on the UK on Ukraine, which we can discuss versus Russia. Now, there is no doubt that the main burden of that, the cost of that, will be borne by Europe, and there is no doubt that it will be borne by German industrial capital. This is the collective suicide of German industrial capital. It's just incredible that it's happening, and it just shows you that in the end, political and other factors are just as important as economic factors when it comes to these things. It looks like Germany has accepted a set of policies through the Americans, which will undermine its own hegemony in Europe. Because, as I indicated to you, the power of Germany comes from its industrial strength. When energy does what it is doing at the moment, and when you cut the supply of cheap and plentiful energy from Russia, which was the mainstay of German industrial energy, covering German industrial energy needs, then the competitiveness of German capital will collapse. Germany is basically shooting itself in both feet at the moment. It's an incredible outcome to see. And what amazes me is that, I mean, I would have thought some time ago, I expected German industry, German industrial capitalists to come out and say enough's enough. To a certain extent, it is happening, but it seems to be happening quietly behind closed doors. There is no forcible presence. That tells you something about the character of Germany. It is highly local and under the thumb of the US overlord. And that is how it's going to remain, I'm afraid.
I guess in imperialism, everybody's assigned their role, and Germany's role is you get to be like the boss, except for when it comes to America. But that said, just to move back for a moment to something that you were discussing earlier, you mentioned a couple times like the freedom of movement, and the situation for workers. I actually lived for just a few months in Berlin, like a few years ago, and I remember there was like different categories of workers that were specifically from different countries. Like a lot of Ukrainian and Polish people were like in domestic work. They were like the cleaners. A lot of, and then also whenever I was out at a restaurant, like a lot of the wait staff was like actually quite highly educated people from Greece and Italy who just couldn't get jobs in their home countries, which speaks to kind of the division of periphery and core that you were speaking about earlier. But I just wanted to note or to use this as an opportunity to bring up the fact that, David Harvey said that the decline in incomes of the white working class in the West has been caused by this new distribution of value. So like the incomes of a large group of people have declined, while the small capitalist class has enjoyed this huge jump in the share of the national income. Basically, the salaries of the managers of companies and banks have increased exponentially, which is, of course, a trend that we've seen around the Western world or around the world in general. So it's only natural for the regime, if you will, to encourage blaming immigrants, right? And creating these media narratives about immigrants and making them the central issue in Europe, because the elite can't just tell the working class, oh, look, guys, like we're going through this stagnation and this decline, so we've decided to get rich with our friends around the world, and this has to be at your expense. Like, they're not going to say that. So instead, immigrants play this key role in immigrants have played this key role in rebuilding Europe, and the demographic situation, of course, on much of the continent, particularly Germany, is such that they're in constant need for young laborers to come and join to come and be workers. And then the West is basically as a result, stealing the most prominent minds in the third world. I mean, I can speak to that here in Lebanon. All of the doctors and dentists are being taken away from us, particularly by Canada right now, as the economic situation here collapses. But, all that's to say that it seems to me that ever since Europe opened its doors through its guest worker program, it hasn't been about welcoming humanity or diversity or about freedom of movement, but it's actually this like pragmatic need for cheap labor, right?
Yes, and even worse than that. The European record on labor is appalling. There is no other way to describe it. It is actually deeply racist and appalling in outlook. But let's take it from the beginning in a way. growing economic inequality is characteristic of neoliberal financialized capitalism. We've witnessed 40 years of extraordinary rise in inequality. As we shifted away from Keynesianism towards neoliberalism, and neoliberalism became the foundation of economic policy, economic inequality has gone through the roof. We know that. There are many reasons for this. One is, of course, the vast possession of wealth by a small elite, which allows them to draw benefits over time. In other words, it isn't labor and work, it's just wealth, property, which is, of course, the foundation of all capitalism in the end. Those who think that they can change capitalism without changing property rights, they haven't thought it through. So property is very, very important, and that is still the foundation of wealth and inequality. But it isn't only property and wealth, it is also income and wage income, because obviously, as we know, Karl Marx argued that a long time ago, and before him, David Ricardo, if wages go down, profits go up. This is a fundamental law of capitalism that remains the same. It has been the same for hundreds of years. Two things have happened here which matter. One holds across, the other is particularly relevant to Europe, which I want to mention. The first is that there's been relentless pressure on real wages across the core countries of the world for the last 4 decades. Relentless pressure to keep real wages down. That's been the mechanism for sustaining profitability in the core countries. And what allowed that policy to entrench itself, other than the weakness of trade unions, obviously, and the weakness of the labor movement, has been the ability to import cheap consumer goods from the East. As capitalism emerged in the East, as we know, independent, powerful capitalism emerged in the East, capable of producing manufacturing goods, China fundamentally, but also India, Korea, Vietnam, and so on. As that emerged in the East, and it started producing consumer goods that went into the wage basket of people in the West, it became possible to keep wages down, but allow people to consume goods that would come cheaply from those parts of the world. And I'm sure you would recognize what I'm talking about here. In a sense, what happened was that the rising productivity of workers in the East rebounded in the interest of capitalists in the West, because it allowed them to keep wages down. So that was one key mechanism. But that's not enough. Obviously, capitalists always look for the ability to obtain cheap labor as a flow of workers coming in. And here, what we've witnessed the last 3-4 decades are incredible shifts and turns by the core countries, Europe being the worst. Why? Europe is based, the European Union is based on the principle of the 4 freedoms, right? One of which, the freedom of capital, essentially, freedom of capital to get established and sell goods and so on and move itself across borders, and the freedom of labor to cross borders. And obviously that, a lot of people on the left presented that as some kind of major achievement of humanity, and that was transcending the nation state and so on. Nothing of the sort. It was basically a mechanism allowing capital to obtain cheap labor force, a cheap labor force internally within the borders of the European Union. This had 2 outcomes. The first is effective depopulation of vast tracts of Europe, as the core has sucked in labor from across what is now the periphery of Europe. Lithuania, for instance, Estonia, for instance, has lost 1 million out of 2.5 million people of its population. Bulgaria has lost 2 million people. Spain has vast tracts of the country depopulated, empty of people. You'll find these people in Berlin, or you will find them in other parts of the core. I'm not blaming them. Obviously, each worker would have to make a decision on how best to deal with an impossible situation and, protect themselves and their families, and people try and make do as best they can and seek a better living. It's a natural thing. If you look at it from a macro perspective, though, it's obvious what's happening. Huge areas of Europe are becoming depopulated. No country can sustain that. No country. Bulgaria cannot survive that way. Entire parts of Greece are depopulated in a similar way. That's the first outcome. The second outcome is, of course, as Europe did that, it created the hardest of hard borders around itself. Freedom of movement within, no freedom of movement from without. And who are kept out? People who don't look like us. In other words, people who come from Middle East, from the Asian subcontinent, from Africa, particularly Africa and the Middle East, of course, which are the areas closest to Europe, but also Afghanistan and so on. And there, Europe has created essentially concentration camps, some of which exist within the borders of the EU, a lot of which exist outside the borders of the EU, alongside the borders. And the biggest concentration camp exists in Turkey, which has between 4 and 5 million people from Syria, from Afghanistan, from elsewhere. Very few of them want to stay in Turkey, obviously. If you ask them, they're not there because they want to be in Turkey. They want to be where there are jobs and so on. They're kept there. And what the EU does is selectively to see how it's going to deal with it, depending on the needs of capital. It's a very, very cynical policy, characteristic of European capital. Those who think that the EU operates a policy on labor, which is an example to the rest of the world, and something that the left would want, they haven't thought about it carefully at all. That's not the case. That's not what's happening. Now you ask me, are we in favor of controls? Is that what we're saying? No. But free movement of capital across borders, as it happens in the EU, is in the interest of capital. It's not in the interest of workers. It's not in the interest of working people to have that kind of regime. It's not in the interest of countries to become depopulated, because that ruins the social life of countries. You might say, what's wrong with 2 million Bulgarians leaving the country? Well, Bulgaria stops functioning as a wealth-based country, loses its youth, right? We're not in favor of that. We're not in favor of the left cannot be in favor of that. Of course, we don't believe in borders. Of course, we want, worker solidarity across borders, of course. But that doesn't mean cross borders, any old how, live in a hovel and survive on nothing and be paid the pittance and ruin the place where you left. It means a policy on the basis of sovereignty and control by workers where they come from. That's a very difficult thing and a very different one to what capital does.
No, that's a really good point. There's a huge difference between freedom of capital to move cheap labor and then actual freedom of movement. And yes, we do get a little bit confused by that on the left sometimes. But I think it's actually a good segue to talk about something that I think that entire structure feeds, which is the rise of the far right, which we've seen across, everybody talks a lot about the rise of the far right in Hungary and Poland, but it's also rising in France and Sweden and Denmark and the UK, of course. So, and it's interesting because this freedom of capital to move cheap labor is feeding into this rise of the far right. So I guess, what is the divide? Because both sides, there's the corporations and the financial markets that like this particular immigration system, but then still support the kind of fortress Europe that keeps out those who maybe don't have the skills that you want for cheap labor. And that is something that they maybe share with the fascist or racist far right. So what is the divide between how corporations and financial markets see the immigration system, and then how, as opposed to the way that the far right sees the immigration system? And do you think that this EU structure is actually feeding into the far right, which then ironically hates the EU structure?
Politics, as you know, can have paradoxical and contradictory outcomes. What's underneath and serves the interests of capital is not necessarily understood in the political arena, or it's not understood for what it is. Capitalism survives on the basis of fetishism, wrong ideology, false ideology, all kinds of things that take place. And confuse people and make things appear the opposite of what they are. That's a characteristic feature of capitalism. Now, immigration is a live issue, of course, and not just in Europe, but across the world. In Europe, it's particularly poignant because the reasons that I spelled out, and also because of the entrenched racism that you find in so many parts of Europe. Let's be frank about it. Europe is the motherlode of imperialism. That's where imperialism came from. That's where it started. The countries that present themselves as paragons of soft power are actually the descendants of the worst imperialists that the world is experienced. Now, imperialism basically meant treating others as inferior to you. It's fundamental dimension of it, and that has left a residue in Europe, irrespective of what people say. There are mechanisms here, mechanisms at play, which are very, very deeply embedded and problematic. I'm not saying that this is what explains what happens, but it has to be factored in. Now, in a situation in which the economy is not growing, and European capitalism is not going anywhere fast, right? And people have got bad jobs, and there's persistent unemployment in large parts of the European continent, and entire sectors get destroyed. Sectors that used to have industrial strength, as in northern France and elsewhere, and they disappear. When that happens, the politics of that situation is very difficult to handle. And the left must have a clear mind and have clear arguments. That has not been forthcoming. What has been forthcoming has been arguments on the right, the extreme right. Now, these are not clear arguments and not valid arguments. They are deeply problematic, but they're simple. They're very simple. One unemployed, say, Belgian, one person from the Middle East, too many. That's what the fascists would say. And that's what they say. And that, for people who don't have other arguments coming to them, for people who don't know what the broader situation might look like, seems sensible. This is my country. I can't get a job. Here is a foreigner who has a job. He's taken mine. It's a wrong conclusion, but it's a very simple conclusion to make. And that's what the right does. The right does it all the time. These foreigners come in, when they come in, and they are the real problem. It's not the case that they're not the real problem, far from it, and they don't come in freely, and that's not what happens. The EU has got a hard border policy, as I explained, but the right can make hay with it. The real difficulty here is what the left does, not what the right does. The right does its business. That's what the fascist right does. So what we need to do is we need to attack the foreigner. We need to get him out. We don't need his family. We don't need his outlook. Get them all back where they came from. The usual stuff that the fascist right will come. And if we need to use violence, we will use violence. The real problem is not what these people say. These people are basically the lowest of the low, and they will always be there. And always they've got a place. And the real issue is what the left does and what the left says. You can't confront this policy. You can't confront this politics through moralizing arguments. You can't do it. You can't come out and say it's not morally right. You can't come out and say it's not a nice thing to do. You can't come out and say whatever else that many people on the left are saying based essentially on identity politics and so on. You can't do that. It doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it. It doesn't persuade working class people. You need arguments that are based on political economy, understand what capitalism is, and explain that the problem is not the poor man or the poor woman coming over from the Middle East or Africa. The problem is capitalist relations and what the capitalist elite does. That's difficult. It's a difficult argument, but the left should be doing it. But the left has not been doing it. Has not been putting it forth. It's not been explaining that the freedom of labor and the capital is not the same thing as the freedom of labor and the socialism, or the freedom of labor that we would want. He hasn't been doing that. He's accepted the domination of these neoliberal ideas and tries to fight back on moral and identitarian politics. He will never cut it. So he gets detached The left has become detached from the working class. At root, that's what it is. There was a time in Europe, I remember it, when the left was an integral part of the working class in the core countries. I don't mean to say that the working class would vote for the left or all the working class would support the left. That's not what used to happen. But there is no question that the working class would recognize the left as our people. We might not agree with them. They might be extreme. They might come up with things that don't work, would say workers, but they're our people. They look like us, they speak like us, they smell like us, right? There was a time when that was the case. And that is a very, very important thing for political organizations. That's what the left should be. It should speak for the poor, it should speak for the oppressed. And it used to do it, right? It was part of it. It's no longer the case. Now you need 2 degrees to be a member of the left. Well, that's how it works. And a lot of the talk is not like that. And the working class understand it. The working class understand it. It doesn't take long to work it out. People sense it immediately. That makes it very difficult to oppose the fascists. Very difficult. Makes it very difficult.
I think that's a pattern that we have across a lot of the maybe Western left, the left in the global North, and some in the global South too. Not to speak to obviously there's been leftist movements that have managed to maintain their ties to movements and actually be from movements still, particularly across Latin America. But yeah, even in the Middle East, the left is very much part of kind of secluded to academia, and sort of the sort of middle class, upper middle class, double degrees, people with PhDs. It's not a terrible thing to have those people on the left, but it certainly does make it more difficult to be rooted in the people who materially are actually the most impacted by economic policy in a negative way. But, I know we've been going for a while now, so I have so many more questions I want to ask you, but I guess I'll have to limit it to just a couple more. I wanted to give you an opportunity, since you do have this forthcoming book about the state of capitalism. And we had talked briefly before that you make some arguments in it about the kind of great power competition led by the US that we're seeing today, and how that's actually more dangerous than at any other time in history. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe give us an idea of, the thesis behind your book and what to expect from it.
The book is done by a collective. So it's an experiment in itself. It's about a dozen of us. Obviously, it's not a collected volume. It's done by a collective. So we tried it, and I think it works. I'm sure it works. Now, I think 2 arguments are important that I can present to you in condensed form. The first is that the pandemic shock we had when the pandemic struck the world, and then the crisis that followed, and the bigger crisis that unfolded, which we call the pandemic crisis, by which we mean that period of 2-3 years. We're in the middle of it right now, huge turmoil. That period showed to us that, neoliberalism or not, contemporary capitalism today is absolutely dependent on the state. The state has not been more important in capitalism ever. I mean, right now, it is almost impossible to think of capitalist accumulation in the core independently of the state. I mean, if it wasn't for the states intervening in 2020, it would have been a complete disaster. The state is hugely powerful, despite all the neoliberal talk, and it wields its power in the interest of the oligarchy that benefits from financialized capitalism. This is very clear. It's clear in the realm of monetary policy. It's clear in the realm of fiscal policy, which the state uses as it suits the oligarchy. The state doesn't intervene in property rights, and it doesn't intervene in production, however. And that's very, very important too, because it tells you what neoliberalism is about. It's not about the market versus the state. That's just a figment of people's imagination. That doesn't exist, right? Neoliberalism ultimately is about capital and labor relations and protecting property rights, and that is non-negotiable for the moment. The state then in the West does that, and it uses first and foremost, in order to do that, not control over resources. It has divested itself from them. It is privatized. It uses control over money. That is a novel and very powerful development of contemporary capitalism. It is the state's ability to control fiat money through the central bank that gives it much of its power in the core of capitalism today. That's a new development. That is a way in which capitalism works, which historically we've never known anything like it. It's contradictory. It doesn't far from smooth. It creates its own problems, but it's there, and you can see it. The Federal Reserve is the most powerful lever of economic policy in the US. The European Central Bank in Europe, the Bank of England in England, and so on, right? In Britain and so on. So that's the first argument we make, and we discuss what the problems will be. In other words, the state can intervene, but it doesn't intervene in production, and it doesn't intervene in restructuring property rights. When you have a situation like we've had the last 2 years, huge problems emerge. The state supports demand because it can intervene, it can create money, it can do fiscal policy. It supports demand, it can boost demand enormously. It doesn't intervene on the supply side. You get inflation, and you get inflation because supply remains weak. The fundamentals of production in Western capitalism remain weak. Profitability is weak, so you get inflation. Inflation comes not from workers; it comes from this imbalance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It comes from the unwillingness to restructure supply. That should be the argument of the left. If you want to deal with these problems, you've got to intervene on the side of production. That means challenging property rights, reorganizing production. Demand is not the real problem today. There's enough demand to give to others right now. So that's the first argument we make. The second argument we make, however, which is also very important, is this. As the state has become more important in contemporary capitalism, as it has, what you get is divergence, increasing divergence. We saw it in the pandemic. Every state followed a different line. We see it on the economy. You get more divergence. That is indicative of greater competition among states, greater divergence, greater stratification, new forms of core and periphery, and we discussed them. New forms of hegemony, new forms of imperialism have emerged. The United States is obviously the dominant hegemonic power, but there are others. But the contestants are not the old imperial powers. It's not Japan. It's not Europe. We discussed it. All the contestants come from what used to be the periphery. China, Russia, and so on. What drives this competition are two things. Internationalization of productive capital. Enterprises, multinational enterprises spreading their tentacles across the world and creating global production networks dominated by the multinationals, competing against each other. And internationalization of finance. Huge financial businesses spreading their tentacles across the world. That's ultimately what drives imperialist contests. This form of capital is the most aggressive form of capital we've known, despair, ever in history. And the hegemon is out to create a framework for it. We are in a way in a world that we last saw before 1914. Imperialism today is driven by economic competition, and there is no obvious point of equilibrium. And the main challenge to the US is obviously China. That's the argument we develop. It will be out next year. We will start presenting it. We think that it will provide a strong input into these debates on the left.
Well, I look forward to reading it, and I hope that once it is out, we can have you back on, and perhaps even before that, because there is so much more to talk about. But of course, there are time limits. So Costas, I want to thank you for joining me. And I don't know, is there anything that you, aside from the book, where can people follow along your work?
We will engage in a sustained effort to publicize the work. We've been caught up with writing it. We will do more work in the coming period. So, watch this space. But all I want to say is that I'm very pleased we had this discussion. Keep up the good work, because what you're doing, I think, is very important. And the more of these programs you do, and the more debates you have of this type, the clearer things become, I think, for the left and for radical arguments.
Well, I certainly hope so. Thank you so much for joining me and helping me just that.
Thank you.